All right. All
I
right, we're
think we're
ready to
ready.
roll. Thank you, everybody, for being here to the first installment of Broadcast from Baku. It'll be the same time next week. This is like a full Q&A session with our COP delegates over in Baku. Thankfully, the network connection is great, and we should be ready to roll. So, to get things started off, can the delegation just talk about introduce themselves, their year, maybe their title, and then what their best experience has been at COP so far?
Great. Um, I'll kick us off. So I'm Kaylee McCarty. I am the Assistant Director of Programs for the Schiller Institute. So year doesn't matter for me. And I think for me, my favorite part so far has just been like being at COP and feeling the energy of all of these people from all over the world, just kind of like running around in this harried fashion to try to get things done about, topics that all matter to all of us. I think that's been really inspiring to be around.
I'm Carly. I'm a 2L at the law school. And my favorite part of COP so far, I think, was actually just one of the briefings that was done by the US delegation, just basically to all the US stakeholders like NGOs and other groups that came on behalf of a US organization. And John Podesta was there, and they basically talked about all the things that the US was looking to get out of COP, as well as everything that they've done so far just in the past 3 days on behalf of the US. So that was really cool.
I'm Sangeeta. I'm also a 2L at the law school, and my favorite part so far has been listening in on some of the conversations relating to human rights and rights-based approaches to dealing with climate change. I want to pursue a career eventually in human rights law work and international law work. So it's been exciting to listen into these conversations and feel a part of that discussion.
I'm Katie Bolton, assistant professor at the Lynch School in Formative Education. Let's say years don't matter for me either. I think the most exciting thing for me has just been to watch all of you, all of the students, to find things that you get passionate about or questions that you're wrestling with, and being able to engage with the content and material and activities and events here and see some of that connect with your own interests. So that's been the best for me so far.
Hello, my name is Gustavo. I'm a grad student in economics, and my best experience here has been talking with so many leaders from all around the world, pretty much, and listening to them and understand what people are doing to fight against the climate change, what's been doing in so many countries. And it's been a really fulfilling experience, really, and it's gave me a lot of insights and good ideas about where we are in terms of climate change, climate justice, and yeah, it's been amazing, really.
Hello guys, my name is Junsu Chong. I'm a junior studying economics and environmental studies. I think my favorite part about COP is the opportunity to sort of network with people that I used to look up to on a more personal level, and also meeting other youth delegates in the space, sort of making the whole fight against climate change more hopeful.
Hi, I'm Leanne. I'm a senior studying global public health. And my favorite part of COP so far has been going to a diverse kind of set of panels, the equity-based ones, and then also the ones led by more corporate leaders, and then getting to digest those panels and see the differences and kind of discrepancies in those with my fellow peers.
Hi everyone, I'm Liz Schwab. I'm a senior studying international studies and communication. And I would say my favorite COP has been sitting in on UN run events. There was one by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees that was really interesting about human rights-based approaches. So I've been really enjoying those.
Perfect. Well, to get things started off in terms of this Q&A, we have a few specific questions for all of you. And the honor of the first question is going to Professor Bolton. So just to give some context, could you kind of tell the difference between a blue zone and a green zone?
Yeah, sure. So at each COP, there are these two different zones. The COP process is oriented around the negotiations. So, COP would not happen if not for the negotiation spaces. And those are usually around key topics that are oriented towards drafting shared language. So like there's one about the new collective quantitative goal, did I get that right? The NCQ. There's a lot of acronyms too. I went to one today drafting a statement about gender and climate change. There are other key issues related to the global stocktake. And so this is the heart of COP, is why it happens, but it has grown to be so much more than that. So in the blue zone, you have, that's where the negotiation occurs and a lot of the sort of high level meetings. And there are different country pavilions where they set up and share about what they're doing related to climate change. And then in the green zone, it seems that the green zone changes a little bit year by year because the green zone is under the COP presidency versus the UNFCCC, which oversees the negotiation process in the blue zone. So the green zone has a lot of other types of events, a lot of corporate events. You know, last year in Dubai, there was a lot more space for the green zone. So there were a lot more kinds of things like art installations and other like, you know, NGOs or Indigenous voices and other kinds of groups that were putting on either events or talks. This year, it seems to mostly be, and I can confirm it from you all, but it seems to be pretty corporate or based on like Azeri interests. Right, there's a few other things, but it's a lot of about Azerbaijan, what Azerbaijan is doing, as well as like drawing people into tourism in Azerbaijan alongside different kinds of corporate representations of what McKinsey is doing or Deloitte or the SOCAR, the Azerbaijani oil company. So it's a really interesting dynamic. Yeah.
Perfect. And the next question is going to Liz. What decisions have been made so far at COP29?
Sure. So there have been like two major ones that we've all been discussing, and I think everyone's been discussing, since it's also pretty early off in the conference. But one of the decisions that was approved was for Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement, which is about carbon markets on an international level. So essentially that got approved in one of the initial meetings, which was kind of seen as like a big win for COP that something got approved super early. But we've also been in a lot of events where they've kind of talked about like the human rights implications of it. It essentially is the portion of the agreement that looks at the different processes and how everything's being monitored. So still ongoing discussions about that, but overall seen as a very good thing. And then the second major thing that happened was the loss and damage fund is now in operation, or got approved to be in operation. So essentially the loss and damage fund is this like international financial mechanism where developed countries give funds to the World Bank to help allocate to developing countries. So it's a fund based on equity and its principle. A lot of details are still being worked out. We know that the World Bank is going to be hosting it, and that the Philippines is going to kind of be like overseeing the board of the fund. But a lot of details on like what the funds will look like and stuff like that are still going to be decided. But yeah, like I said, since it's still pretty early off in the conference, those have kind of been the two big wins so far.
Perfect. Next question is going to Sangeeta. What or how is justice and equity playing a role in COP29?
Sure, so justice and equity are implicated in several different areas in COP. Largely, the narrative has been looking at the ways that climate change and climate change measures themselves are disproportionately impacting vulnerable populations. And so some of the discussions I've been following are the ways that justice and equity should play a role in climate finance, loss and damage, and just transition. So with climate finance, and Jinsu will talk more about COP being the finance COP, but the idea that climate finance needs to be accessible and geared towards vulnerable groups, and ensuring that some of these climate finance solutions are readily available and transparent, and ensuring that they're well distributed. And then with loss and damage, as Liz just described, this idea that there's a vision for countries to be able to address these effects, these irreversible effects of climate change that have already transpired. And so a focus on small island developing states and these least developed countries in ensuring that they're able to access the proper resources, knowledge, funding to move that forward. And then lastly, looking at the just energy transition, advocating for labor rights and clean energy as we're moving towards some of these clean energy technologies and creating special legal protections for vulnerable people. So that's a good little gloss over about different areas and how justice and equity plays a role in each of those.
That was a great overview. All right, so Carly, what happens in those blue room negotiations?
Yeah, so I've been lucky to be able to attend several negotiations in the past 3 days that I've been in the Blue Zone. And in all of these negotiation rooms, essentially the large conference room, and every country is represented. They have a little banner at their table with their country, and delegates from those countries are there at the tables. There's a couple facilitators who sit at the front and basically lead the negotiation. And what they're essentially negotiating is actually not the Paris Agreement itself, or not like the actual document that's already been ratified as a treaty, but instead the guidance on each particular section of those agreements that have already been kind of like certified by COP. So for the most part, we look at, for example, like the Paris Agreement, and Article 6 is the one that has gotten the most attention so far at this conference. And so, as Liz was mentioning before, with 6.4, the guidance on that was essentially several drafts that had been negotiated so that basically the parties have agreed to give meaning to a certain section or even a certain word itself of the actual agreement. And so in the negotiation rooms, they will have a draft for the negotiation that's happening, and it gets distributed to all the parties and observers that have signed up to basically receive that draft. And the guidance is basically dissected word for word, and every party is given a chance to kind of raise their flag, get called on by the facilitators, and contribute their takes on what the guidance is currently saying and how it can be improved for the next draft. And so, being in the Blue Zone for only 3 days, I won't have time to, actually see the progression of a lot of these drafts, but theoretically by the end, there will be meetings that have met 3-4 times, and after each time the negotiation meets, that certain group will basically come up with a new draft based on the input that was given by the countries during that session. And so at every single point, it's getting closer and closer to a cohesive guidance on the Paris Agreement or on whatever they're working on. And that guidance will eventually be approved and closed. And so when that happens, there will be like, for example, a more stringent mechanism on how carbon credits are actually being measured with regard to like an actual country's contribution, or an actual organization's like carbon. So just basically like standardizing a standard or whatever it may be that just gets closer and closer to a cohesive agreement between all the countries involved.
Perfect. And then Jinsu, why is COP29 the finance COP?
Well, I think everyone sort of covered it, but obviously, the $100 billion goal was replaced by the newly collective quantified goal of the NCQG. So we're expecting a lot of negotiations in terms of who's paying how much and why. And separate from the NCQG, there's the loss and damage fund, which, like Liz mentioned, got operationalized. And there will be talks on how that fund is sort of distributed, how we can do that in an equitable manner. And to sort of like touch on other aspects of the finance COP, I think like the importance of organizations like the Green Climate Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank is growing. Like today, I attended a GCF reporting session where they were talking about how they can actually improve like the organizational structure, like how they're allocating these funds, and sort of ways to measure if they're doing this in an efficient way. So there's a lot of talks on funds in general. In the Blue Zone recently, they set up a climate fund pavilion where all the different types of funds like the GCF, the adaptation fund, like the Asian Development Bank. They're all convening to sort of share what their progress is and sort of what their plans are moving forward to sort of improve this whole process. And then similarly, there's a lot of discourse on measures like the carbon credit system, green bonds, and sort of ways that economies are transitioning to a more sustainable and climate friendly system. Like recently, like emerging concepts like bioeconomies, right? Like how we can like consider natural resources as something that we can leverage to sort of tackle the climate issue rather than like just looking at this, like looking at them like traditional resources like we did in the past for fuel and whatnot. So I think overall there's definitely a sort of overarching theme in a way, whereby money and you know, political economies and all of that are growing in terms of importance. So yeah.
Perfect. Perfect. And then Leanne, what have you noticed in the Azerbaijani-led conversations in the Green Zone?
Yeah, so to contextualize Azerbaijan as a host country a little bit, Azerbaijan is a petrostate and relies on gas and oil as their primary like income for the country, and they also have a few other larger geopolitical issues going on. So there is some controversy around them hosting COP to begin with, but by hosting COP, they also have a platform to push their own goals and demonstrate their engagement within the larger climate context and possibly bring legitimacy to their claims of wanting to get more involved in climate action. So through this, we've seen kind of two ongoing themes. In the blue zone and within the larger negotiations, the COP president, who is from Azerbaijan, has really been pushing for the operationalization of the loss and damage fund, and also pushing for Article 6, as Liz mentioned, to be passed right away to create a positive momentum with the negotiations. But then in the green zone side, as Professor Bolton mentioned, there is a lot of corporate presence, and mostly corporate presence, who are all associated with or directly under the Azerbaijani state. And within this, we've honestly seen a lot of greenwashing, where they talk about different initiatives that the corporations are trying to take, like investing in cleaner energy sources, and justifying the need for fossil fuels within the just transition process. And all of those kind of just push the oil and natural gas agenda instead of pushing more equity-based processes. So we've kind of seen both sides of them backing equity and justice-based practices in the blue zone, and then kind of greenwashing their more like corporate-led initiatives in the green zone.
Perfect. And then the final question before we hand it off to the audience for Gustavo. So the next COP is in Brazil. What do you expect from that event?
Well, hello. Thanks for having me. It's been a really good like opportunity here, like to hear from politically my home country how the next COP's gonna be. It's gonna be in a region that's been significantly impacted by the climate change. There are a lot of social issues around, and they are kind of like trying to create and draft really how the next COP is gonna be regarding like the main topics, like what kind of social impact we want to create and discuss for the country, for Brazil, and honestly for the emerging markets. And it's been fascinating because I could like hear and even talk with people that are really close to the president of Brazil or the governor of the state that next COP's gonna be. So they are expecting right now pretty much the next COP, which is a really important one, which is gonna be the third one. So that's a really good mark. That's an important mark for the COP as the United Nations right now it's discussing the climate change. But like pretty much what I'm feeling and by what I'm hearing is that they wanted to have a COP that it's gonna talk about the business, like how the energy transition is gonna be, and how like society, especially like the emerging countries, they're gonna benefit by the climate transition, and how like really like society and like poor people are gonna be like better off in the next few years, especially into 2050. So it's been a really good experience.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that. All right. All right, who here has any questions for them? See if there's a microphone.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing all of your insights. I have a question, I guess for everyone, but maybe Professor Bolton can speak a little bit more to this. A topic this year has been a movement towards more badges for the Global South. Is that something that you've seen on the ground, or does it feel more or less the same as last year or previous years? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. And we heard a little bit from Catherine Goldberg today, who's the BC alum on the US negotiating team. I think it's a lot as we expected, in the sense that, what Catherine was saying is that last year it was decided that there needs to be expanded opportunities for more equal geographic representation. And the way the secretary interpreted that as like cut badges from Europe and America. I think that, that as this sort of like key move doesn't necessarily open up more opportunities for others. So just for example, a very dear colleague of mine at the State University of Zanzibar in Tanzania, she heard, with about a month to prepare, that she could have a badge, but then how is she supposed to muster the resources to come? All the hotels were booked. I tried to help find her a hotel, and there was only like an 8-man hostel, and it's like, she's a Muslim woman, like that's not going to work for her. So I think there are a lot of sort of broader structural barriers to that make it difficult to simply say, okay, the number of badges is switched. So, I don't know if I have necessarily seen any huge difference, but I can't say I've necessarily also been like counting or anything. But I'm curious about others' perceptions as well. We'll see. I mean, we hear that the US delegation, as well as RINGO, which is the Research and International NGO group, has been having some serious conversations with the Secretariat about that for next year. So I'm hoping that there will be a bit of a re-examination of that. But it's definitely those that are in Europe and the United States that have the most financial resources to make this happen, as well as we can see the diversity of our own delegation, that, it's not just those with American passports coming. So at any rate, yeah, I don't know if others have anything to say about that.
All right.
Thanks. Hi, guys. I have a question for anyone that's noticed this. Obviously, in the wake of the election, we've all been anticipating what the US's changing role is going to be in these negotiations. Are you seeing countries like the UK step up and fill the role in leading some of these discussions, or is the US still playing a big role? Like, how is that dynamic playing out?
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about the briefing from the US delegation that I went to today. Essentially, it talked about this exactly, and about the role of the US pending the transfer of power to the next administration. And so John Podesta, he's the advisor to the president on climate issues, like international climate issues. And so he was the one doing the briefing, and he's actually the highest leader who's at the conference, which is actually a little bit surprising, just given the fact that most other countries have sent someone in the past two or 3 days who is like an actual president, vice president of their country, or the equivalent. And so yeah, it's been referred to as like a lame duck, I think, delegation, just in that we don't have actual leaders of our country attending. And so I do think that is definitely affecting perhaps the energy that the US delegation is bringing to the conference. But in this press briefing, he definitely, or it wasn't a press briefing, but just briefing to other US delegates at the conference, he talked about how when we look at NDCs, which are the nationally determined contributions for greenhouse gas, and so the idea is that we would lower them ambitiously every year to basically reach long-term goals of greenhouse gas reductions. even though the US is still going to push for ambitious targets and reductions, because Biden is still the president and Biden's presidency and administration does have strong, ambitious climate goals. Once and if, I guess I should say, but pretty much everyone is in agreement, once Trump backs out of the Paris Agreement, those nationally determined contributions will no longer be in effect for the US. And so that will affect, I think, how we're perceived. And so a lot of what I think the US delegation is working on is making sure that the things that we agree to are not so out of the realm of possibility with the Trump administration that there's no chance of us meeting them, because I think that would reduce our credibility in the long run to basically say that we, as under Biden's administration, have these really strong targets and then just simply fall short once we do change over. And so I think the thing that was hopeful was that even if the next 4 years don't look great and the US contributions to the climate change necessary action, it doesn't mean that it won't come back to being at a stronger level, and that 4 years in the scheme of an issue that will not be solved in 4 years under equity means, no one's saying that this issue would be solved in 4 years anyway, that basically maintaining those connections and kind of realizing that this is a small period of time and the reality of a huge crisis is something that has kept, I think, a lot of people in the US delegation at least from panicking or thinking that this is the end all be all of the US's role in negotiations. I don't necessarily think it's affected the US delegation very much in its role. I think they've always been looked to, especially considering that a lot of the delegates now on the negotiations team for the US are still kind of the ones that have been going for the last couple of conferences. They're well respected, and so they still do get a strong mic when it comes to basically negotiating in negotiations rooms.
Hey everyone, thank you guys. My question was just how has countries within the global south or smaller countries been included in negotiations you've seen in the blue zone, or possibly not included, and just what have you guys seen?
I'll just say, I think it is interesting that, technically everybody's included. Technically everybody's at the table. At the negotiation I attended this morning, it was interesting because there were a few, I would say there was up to 8 representatives from countries that spoke the most, and then a few other ones. But a lot of times, I think that with the developing countries or small island states, it seems that they tend to, many of them speak on behalf of the broader sort of coalitions. So G77 in China or AOSIS, these other groups that they've already consulted with. So I've noticed, at least in this particular negotiation, that these groups are represented, but also that they do a lot of work ahead of time to kind of get a shared vision in their coalition to then be able to speak with a stronger voice at the negotiation, whereas the US doesn't speak on behalf of any other group, the US just speaks. Has it been your?
Yeah, I definitely agree that it has been predominantly a couple of people who speak at the negotiations, or at least the ones I've attended. And there's a lot of countries who come, they set up their table, they have their name in the back, but because they're represented, like you said, by another group, they don't necessarily contribute in the same way that other nations do. And the negotiations take a lot of work on behalf of the actual delegates speaking, because not only do they have to be up to date, but they have to have specific things that they're looking to add or change in the guidance that's being proposed. And I think as an observer, it's hard to stay up to date with what's actually going on. And so having 15 different paragraph sections that you're looking to change and why you want to change them, I think is something that takes a lot of research and work, and not every country has the resources to come to every negotiation prepared to do that.
I will just add that attending some of the side events, for instance, and some of the conversations that are geared more towards human rights and global South issues. We've seen a lot more of this global South leadership stepping up. I attended a high level conversation this morning related to resource extraction, and that was led by the president of Zimbabwe. So you're seeing more so than before, global South leaders and analysts, scientists being able to speak more about the issues affecting their local communities and also having more of a seat at the table. And then something else that I've noticed is in some of these conversations that at the leadership of some of these UN groups like the UNCTAD, which is the Trade and Development Organization, or even some of the representatives of the Secretary General are coming from the Global South. So the former Vice President of Costa Rica now works as an advisor to the Secretary General. So you're able to see at least a changing up in the leadership a little bit more, even though in the larger negotiations, there's definitely the US and developed countries are taking the lead. The Global South is able to get some actually in those issues that are implicating their countries and their concerns.
Perfect.
I've read recently that the president of Azerbaijan is all for, expanding the fossil fuel industry. And it's really interesting considering, COP is being hosted now. How has that influenced the energy or momentum of the conference so far?
Yeah, I mean.
I can talk.
Go for it, go for it.
Okay, well, yeah, Azerbaijan's definitely like an oil country. You can see like the biggest company here in the country, it's SOCAR, which is the state oil company of Azerbaijan Republic. It's like it's present in the COP. Actually, they have a huge like area inside of the green zone, just talking about like what they're doing and what they're doing in terms of sustainability and green like transition. They wanted to show for the world like that they are responsible, that they are environmentally responsible, really. But there are a lot of also people saying that they are doing all that marketing behind the company and this COP really like to not show exactly all the spending that they are doing fossil fuel consumption and what they were really wanted to do in the next few years probably is like to increase their spend on fossil fuels here in Baku and in the whole Azerbaijan region. But yeah, that's a really good question, especially because like this country was like developed by oil and all the countries around here pretty much they rely on this. So what they're gonna be doing in the next few years, that's the biggest question regarding this, but yeah.
Yeah, to add to that, I feel like not just the momentum of this COP, but of like climate action in general, the corporations that are leading the conversations of maintaining fossil fuel are hoping to keep fossil fuel and oil within the industries for years to come. Like their decarbonization efforts goals end in like 2050 instead of the 2030 marks that a lot of countries have. So I think the fact that these corporations have such a large stake in the conversations and in the presence just really speaks to how much kind of willpower they have to change in these ways. And since everything is really corporate driven, especially by these large fossil fuel and oil companies, I think like change will not be as quick, and reliance on fossil fuels for things like clean energy transition and for other mitigation and adaptation processes is just going to continue. So it's just a balance of relying on these resources and whether or not we can find other processes that will actually create change during this time of reliance.
Perfect. Perfect. Anyone else?
Sorry, just off that, this is a quick question, but have they been talking a lot about carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration as a result?
Yeah, that's definitely something that's been pushed a lot. There's been a lot of side effects and it's come up in a lot of negotiations just because of the new collective quantified goal. I would say there's a lot of mixed opinions on it. It's being brought forth as a possible new solution. But I think a lot of the scientists in the events and the different advisors have been pushing back on it a little bit, saying there's not enough research to ensure that it wouldn't actually take more emissions. Essentially, the technology to take carbon out of the atmosphere requires a lot of energy to do that. So the worry is that the energy that it will take to do that will end up like producing more emissions than it will take away. So that's been like a huge point of contention that's come up. But at the same time, it's kind of been, I guess, in a way, like idolized as a very new solution that can help a lot of countries reach their like national goals. It's just since it is so new, I think there's a little bit of hesitation around it.
Yeah, and I think likewise, in the Blue Zone, there was a lot of movement among businesses that are in like the sort of delegation pavilions, discussing carbon capture technologies and sort of understanding that these technologies can be limited in terms of like how much carbon they actually capture and how expensive it is, how much fuel they can be using. So they're pivoting to sort of like nature-based solutions, like conserving forest areas or like kind of like different sort of solutions like blue carbon capture using like oceans and like sort of like rivers and stuff like that to capture carbon. So it's really interesting to see how there's like competing like sort of business interests in the sphere as well, like different sort of supply and demand dynamics. A lot of like banks and sort of financial institutions are looking to grow their portfolio in a way that includes these carbon capture technologies and even like startups, and also like sort of like governmental institutions, like think tanks, and like all of those organizations are also pushing to sort of invest more in like the research and development of these technologies and also looking at different solutions and how sort of feasible they are in the.
Yeah. So, and then just to add on that too, I sat in on an event and there was a representative from the US delegation, like based in California, I think. And he was saying, for example, in the US, like corporations are the #1 investors in like carbon capture technology. One incentive might be to like invest in that with the chance that they could like emit more, like that the carbon capture would like counterbalance that. But I think they mentioned that like Microsoft was like I think they invest in or like have invested in like 40% of carbon capture technology from the US. So it kind of gives you an idea of like who's pushing for it versus who's not.
Hi, can you guys see me?
Yeah.
Okay, hi. So I have two questions. The first is, I just heard Microsoft, so that's reminding me of something. What about the question about data centers and how how much energy they're using, how they're energy hogs and what that's going to do to the efforts on climate? Has that been a conversation anyplace?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Steinberg. I was actually talking to Leanna about that earlier today. So the reason why Microsoft purchased, actually it was from a startup in Brazil, Mumbach. So they purchased these carbon credits based off carbon dioxide capture in the Amazon. And a lot of the AI modeling and like the growth of sort of like the AI in the recent business sphere is spiking demand from a complementary industry, which is data center infrastructure. So these supercomputers require a lot of cooling as they create and generate these AI models, which obviously requires a lot of water and electricity and all of that. And so I guess like going back to your question, there was a lot of sort of tech companies also talking about how like from the buyer side, like how they're looking to sort of be conscious of the whole idea that their data centers are also requiring a lot of carbon credits and also like energy. And also like sort of adding on to that, more so than carbon credits, something that came up with the conversation about data centers was the use of electricity grids and how they were going to sort of improve that. And that things like electricity grids require a little bit more than simply private sector investment. It's something that like private sector companies need to discuss with the government as well, because it's in most countries, it's sort of state-owned and it's sort of regulated by the country. So yeah, definitely a lot of conversations, dialogue on data centers, a lot of like pavilions. I went to the Japan pavilion yesterday, and I know Hitachi was, they were talking about like how like this like new electricity system that can cool computers in a more efficient manner. So yeah, a lot of
Yeah.
a lot of dialogue in that area, yeah.
Can I ask another question?
Absolutely.
Okay. Recall at the COP last year, there was talk about this conflict between food security and emissions of global greenhouse gases, particularly nitrous oxides. That nitrogen is so important in harvests and that is so important in harvesting and in agriculture around the world, particularly in the global south. And yet that creates tension with respect to increasing emissions of nitrous oxides and methane too, I believe. So, of course, that's a question that our Schiller Core faculty member Hanqing Tian deals with a lot. And I'm just wondering if that tension has shown up this year in anything that you've seen at COP. So in other words, I'll be more clear, some countries who are feeling that they have to continue their food production the way that they do their food production. And many of them are not wealthy countries, and yet they're being told, wait a second, if you do that, then you're increasing our emissions and now we have more climate change. So I'm just wondering if that tension has shown up in anything that you've seen.
I haven't seen anything related specifically to the food sector, or I guess like agriculture, but I did go to a like plenary talk on non-carbon greenhouse gases and methane. And basically the point of that was to try to get other countries aside from the US to, and there's several other countries who have already agreed to this, but basically getting countries to agree to include those non-carbon greenhouse gases and methane in their basically in their like nationally determined contributions. And so what that means is like they have to limit them in the same way that they're trying to limit carbon. And so China is one of the countries that has actually, since the start of this COP, just I think it was either today or like late yesterday, agreed that they would start basically limiting that like methane and like the nitrous oxide, basically limiting those in the same way that they're limiting carbon, and that contribution itself will really decrease the amount of like just chemical or just like pollutants going into the atmosphere. So I think there is like probably going to be more tension as that agenda to include more of those non-carbon like greenhouse gases in countries' plans is pushed. And so I definitely will keep an eye out for that tension going forward.
Another thing that I wasn't exactly related, but today I went to a talk that was about like farmers getting involved into the voluntary carbon credit market and farmers being able to offset their emissions through investing in carbon credits instead of just large corporations doing it more on a small scale, which I'm not exactly sure how that would work. It was just someone proposing it within a larger carbon credit meeting. But I guess that's a potential solution.
Great.
Hi guys, how are you guys doing? It's so nice to see you. It's Sancha. Hi.
Just your help.
Of course. Just wondering, I know you guys met with Catherine Goldberg and you went to the Donald Trump's event too. So just wondering, how has the US stance on, I guess, negotiation tactics maybe changed, or like maybe key points that have changed? And specifically, I guess, in terms of funding, because I know that the entire policy change now is like trying to keep as much finance domestic as possible. Do you guys see changes in, I guess, US pledging towards funds? Has that been a point of conversation?
Well, one thing that came up in our discussion today with her was she kind of presented this orientation towards we're just trying to get it all out now before the administration change in a couple months, with the idea of like yeah, like let's just kind of get the money in motion. So there's that. But certainly, I mean, the sense that we got from her, but maybe you can share more about the rest of the delegation, was that, you know, a lot of like the key negotiating points aren't necessarily going to change. Whereas like, even if the broader sort of participation in the Paris Agreement is dismantled, that the nitty-gritty actually isn't changing that much. So but then again, this question of funding is pretty serious. You mentioned more about nuclear.
Oh, so well, I mean, I think like with nuclear, that is something that is bipartisan. And so I believe there was like an initiative yesterday, and I went to a side conference on this today about the tripling nuclear by 2050. And so the US has already agreed to that. And nuclear is one of the issues that is pretty much like a bipartisan issue in the US. And so it was something that like in the infrastructure, sorry, what's it called? Oh my gosh, the Inflation Reduction Act, they basically were talking about how that was something like, even though the entire thing maybe wasn't supported by Republicans, like nuclear was always something that was like pretty much bipartisan, and that was something that could continue. And there's other things like within the US delegation that they're basically pushing for that are not necessarily issues they think that a Trump administration would try to walk back on the international scale if they were committed to or discussed. And so I think there is some like hope there and silver linings within the whole framework of like an entire like climate conference where there's a lot of different things going on. There's some things that are not seen necessarily as a super partisan issue that will be completely washed away with the new administration. And so I think that gives a lot of people hope, just, you know, knowing that there is still lots of room for improvement and room for ambitious goals.
And just jumping off of that, and based on the conversation we had today with Catherine Goldberg, she was talking about in terms of funding that John Podesta announced that they'd already met the $3 billion goal for their prepare for adaptation, as well as the $11 billion in climate finance. And so the general orientation of how US leadership is going is that, yes, they're kind of looking towards who else can take on that US prominent place in these COP negotiations in the event of a Trump administration and what is going to come to that. But I think the US team, and you know, based on what Carly has said about the briefing as well, I think they recognize the unique value, and Catherine Goldberg in particular noted how the US delegation is particularly detail oriented and process driven, and so there is definitely a role that they still see for themselves, and so they're pushing these financial goals still, and still willing to participate and provide their insights into these discussions in the near term.
Gotcha. Thanks, guys. Have so much fun the rest of the couple days that you guys have there.
Thank you.
All right, we got one more person.
I just had a quick question. I think it can be really interesting, but often complex to see different countries negotiating over a variety of different issues. I'm curious about your perspectives, being able to try to think through balancing countries who may have different perspectives and ideas that may sometimes be in contradiction with each other, and what it's been like for you personally to try to understand maybe what those negotiations look like, or how to balance points that at times may be in conflict.
So I can start off with this question and then anyone can tag on. I think generally in some of the conversations that I've been listening in on, there are people that are in the camp of an economics-based solution to climate change and those that are taking on a rights-based solution to climate change. And I think it's become more and more interwoven as the COPs have progressed and also as the discussions day by day have progressed. And so a lot of the orientation of some countries are focused on what are the ways that we can economically incentivize climate change and climate action versus other groups are looking at climate change as more of this natural phenomenon that's affecting these vulnerable populations that's bound to affect everyone else. And so we need to orient our climate action towards tackling those rights-based issues and those issues, and that's really centered around the global south. And so a lot of the tensions that I followed even in other negotiations that you even see in the UN General Assembly, where there is that conflict between developed countries and developing countries, even just more largely in those economic paradigms versus the rights paradigms. That's a real tension that I'm seeing in these negotiations, but I think over time those interests are converging, and I think there is a realization that's being come to that there can't really be this rights-based progress without some sort of economic incentivization for countries to ease off using those, and that also any economic solution does need to be equity-based and address the issues that vulnerable populations have faced and are going to face in the coming years.
And to add on to that, something that we were just talking about today, specifically related to Article 6.4 and kind of how that whole process went down, where it was rushed to be accepted, even though Tuvalu objected and they didn't discuss it, although they objected because they thought there wasn't, basically Article 6.4 is like oversight on the carbon market, and they thought there wasn't enough oversight, which would possibly lead to using it and causing more inequities. So we were discussing how they can balance trying to pass things and whether it's better to pass something so something is out there or not pass anything at all, and whether there is a possibility to find something that they can pass that has less holes in it to create more inequities. So yeah, I just think that's something that we've been grappling with, like whether or not it's better to just pass something and get it out there or have nothing at all, even though it might create more problems in the future.
Anybody else? Any final questions? All right, maybe to end off, what has been the most interesting conversation you've had with someone? Who was it with, and why was it interesting? Anybody can jump into that.
I can start. Today I met an LLM student, which for those of you who don't know, is basically a conversion of a degree from a different country into a US degree. So he's an LLM student at the University of Minnesota. But before that, he was a judge in Egypt. And so I think he still will go back and sit as an administrative law judge in Egypt. And so I just started talking to him semi-randomly, and we found out that we were both law students. And so we, we're just chatting about that in law school. And it was just kind of wild to just basically talk to someone who's an Egyptian judge. Just, grab a coffee with him, as if that was not a big deal at all. And he was so interested in my life in Boston. And I was like, I feel like I need to know more about this.
Exactly.
Being a judge.
I also met that Egyptian law student, so that's a little strange. We sat next to each other in a negotiation and spoke Arabic with each other a little bit. So that was very funny.
Anybody else?
I was in line for coffee today. I didn't mean to peek, but there was this guy in front of me and with his like wallet open, and I saw the T card. So I was like, well, I have to ask this. I was like, are you from Boston? He like looked at me weird, like, how did you know that? And I explained like, oh, like you're from Boston College, I'm with my university faculty, staff, and other students. And then he told me he was from Boston, but he's based in DC working for the Adaptation Fund. And he gave me his contact and offered like if you reach out, like I'll talk to maybe some of the people on Delegate. So that was like a super random like seeing a T card in Azerbaijan is
Thousands of miles away, exactly.
Yeah, I think another really cool part of COP is like the city right now is filled with like delegates and like very important, impressive people. So for example, we went out to dinner last night. We were sitting next to like a representative from Singapore who's running like a major company there, and we were just like talking to him. And it's like those conversations too, or like yesterday I sat the bus going to COP next to another Emory student who was here as a delegate from their side. So it's also the informal conversations that have been really important and enriching, I think.
Sure.
They sound awesome. Anybody else?
Yeah, sure. Actually, like I think what's funny, we were in Frankfurt and we were waiting like the gate, our flight, and the running guy, an old gentleman, came to us and said, well, the gates just changed. And we were, okay, thank you, sir. And we started to chat, and in Baku, we found that he was the Minister of Agriculture for Belize. And I think those are the situations where like you're experiencing that COP conference and like the United Nations conference, like a random gentleman, it happens to be the minister of a country, which is really fun. And yeah, I think I would like have similar like experience, like chatting with people here and finding out that, well, that's an important person in a certain country, and that's really cool.
That is incredible. All right, well, I think we're right at about time. So thank you all so much across overseas for joining. I know it's almost 9 o'clock at night there, so hopefully you get some sleep if you're still not jet lagged. And thank you all for being here in person.
And then we'll come back and be jet lagged. Yeah,
Yeah, there you go. Exactly. So it's a never-ending cycle. It'll be the same time, same place next week, I believe. So 11 a.m. And then it'll be 8 p.m. their time. So we're excited for that as well. Have a great week at COP.
Thank
you.